In 1941, the Empire of Japan stood at the height of its confidence. Across the Pacific, its armies had swept through Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with frightening speed. Hong Kong had fallen, Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, had collapsed in humiliation. To Tokyo, the Western powers were decadent, soft, unfit for the tropics. For years, Japanese military doctrine had preached the superiority of the Asian soldier in the jungle. They trained their men to live off the land, to fight in heat and mud where others would break. In contrast, American and British soldiers were caricatured as industrial warriors reliant on machines, paralyzed without supply lines, fearful of nature itself. By mid-1942, that confidence met its first real test. The Allies, reeling from Pearl Harbor and defeat after defeat, sought a place to strike back. Their eyes settled on an island few had ever heard of, Guadalcanal, part of the Solomon Islands chain stretching southeast from New Guinea. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield there, a project that, once complete, could threaten Allied communication lines to Australia. For the Americans, it was an opportunity born of necessity. In August 1942, under the newly formed command of the 1st Marine Division, Operation Watchtower began. It would be the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific and the first time U.S. ground forces would confront the Japanese Army head-on. The landing was chaotic. Navy transports dropped Marines onto beaches still littered with coconut husks from Japanese labor camps. For a brief, surreal moment, the landings went almost uncontested. The Japanese garrison had fled into the hills, unprepared for an amphibious invasion so soon. Within days, the Americans seized the half-finished airfield, soon christened Henderson Field. But the real battle was just beginning. The jungle closed in fast. Temperatures soared. Supplies ran thin. Rations spoiled in the humidity. Dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion tore through the ranks as mercilessly as bullets. The smell of decay lingered over everything: rotting vegetation, animal carcasses, and the bodies of men lost to the heat. Then came the Japanese counterattack. From Rabaul, Japan's forward base in New Britain, troops were flown and shipped south under the command of Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi. He carried orders to annihilate the enemy and recapture the airfield. Tokyo's war planners believed the jungle itself would assist their cause. American soldiers, they thought, could not possibly sustain combat in such conditions. In their estimation, disease, terrain, and night would do what bullets could not. They did not yet understand who they were facing. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not the same men who had watched Pearl Harbor burn. Many were young, yes, some barely 20, but their discipline was iron. They adapted quickly, learning to navigate the labyrinthine jungle trails, to fight in ambushes, to dig in for days under rain that never seemed to stop. By late August, both sides were starving, both sides exhausted. Yet neither would yield. For the Japanese, every night assault was an act of faith that the Emperor's warriors could overcome the weak foreigner through willpower and courage alone. For the Marines, every defense was an act of survival, not just for the island, but for the idea that America could endure this kind of war. In Tokyo, the early reports from Guadalcanal were confident. The Imperial General Headquarters expected a swift and decisive victory. The operation was not even considered a major campaign, merely a necessary correction, a minor purge of an unwelcome intrusion. But behind the optimism lay a dangerous assumption. Japan's military hierarchy, steeped in the code of Bushido, believed that spiritual strength outweighed material might. The American soldier, they thought, fought for paychecks and comfort. The Japanese soldier fought for emperor and eternity. To their minds, that faith alone could overcome shortages in food, ammunition, or equipment. Reality began to erode that illusion almost immediately. The first Japanese counterlandings on Guadalcanal were small, piecemeal detachments rushed south through the narrow Tokyo Express, a nightly convoy of destroyers darting down the slot under cover of darkness. They landed exhausted, underfed, and often disoriented. Yet they were ordered to attack immediately, without reconnaissance, against entrenched Marines supported by artillery and air power. The jungle that was supposed to favor them now betrayed them. Rain turned the trails into rivers of mud. Maps were useless. Radio contact was sporadic or lost entirely. Wounded men vanished into the trees, never to be found again. Meanwhile, on the American side, the struggle for survival became a daily ritual. The Navy, fearing Japanese air and submarine attacks, withdrew its transports soon after the landings, leaving the Marines short on ammunition, fuel, and food. Rations were cut to half. Cans of Australian bully beef became gold. Soldiers scavenged for coconuts, boiled unripe fruit, and drank from streams teeming with disease. And yet, the Americans held. Their engineers completed Henderson Field under constant bombardment, carving a runway out of red volcanic soil and swamp. From there, a handful of battered F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless bombers took to the skies, their pilots living on the edge of exhaustion, sleeping beside their planes, eating rations mixed with mud. These men would soon be known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the island's code name. Every plane that lifted off from Henderson meant a lifeline, every one shot down, a wound to the entire defense. Still, morale remained strangely unbroken. The Marines began to adapt. They learned to fight at night, to listen for movement in the brush, to recognize the faint metallic click of a Japanese bayonet being fixed in the dark. They learned to move silently, to conserve ammunition, to let the jungle hide them as it hid their enemy. The Japanese, too, fought with fanatic determination, but their doctrine could not keep pace with their reality. Commanders on Rabaul continued to underestimate the enemy, sending fresh waves of troops with little coordination. Entire units vanished in night assaults, lost to American machine guns and artillery that cut through the foliage with deadly precision. By September, the battle had become a grinding war of attrition, a test of endurance neither side had anticipated. The Japanese Navy still dominated the seas at night, but daylight belonged to American aircraft. The island was cut off, isolated, soaked in blood and monsoon rain. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers began to doubt. Their officers preached perseverance, but hunger gnawed at every conviction. Disease hollowed the ranks. Bodies were buried shallow, then unearthed by flooding. The invincible warrior of the Emperor was now a man trudging through filth, praying for food, hearing the endless drone of American planes above. The Americans, for all their suffering, began to sense something shifting. The longer they endured, the more they learned. And the more they learned, the more the myth of Japanese superiority faded. By the end of September 1942, Guadalcanal was no longer a minor campaign. It was a crucible, the place where the Pacific War's true nature was revealed. Not swift victories, but a contest of endurance, adaptation, and will. And within that crucible, each side began to craft the methods and myths that would shape every battle that followed. For the men on Guadalcanal, the jungle was not a backdrop, it was the enemy. It swallowed light, muffled sound, and punished every step. The ground beneath their boots was a mixture of ash, clay, and rotting leaves. When it rained, and it rained almost every day, the world turned to brown sludge. For Japanese soldiers, this was supposed to be familiar terrain. They had been trained in tropical warfare, taught to live on rice, dried fish, and discipline. But the distance from supply lines made even that impossible. Men survived on handfuls of rice a day, or on coconuts hacked from the trees. Some boiled strips of leather or roots for sustenance. Marines suffered differently. Their packs were heavy with gear ill-suited for the heat, wool uniforms, thick socks, and helmets that trapped sweat. They slept on damp ground, their bodies covered in insect bites. Yet they adapted. They learned to string hammocks between trees, to ration cigarettes, to wash their socks in rainwater. Both sides feared the same things: malaria, dysentery, and the invisible enemy that could appear from any shadow. At night, the jungle came alive. Every rustle sounded like movement. Every distant cough could mean discovery. Flares lit the canopy in ghostly blue, followed by silence so complete it made hearts pound. Soldiers slept in short bursts, rifles clutched across their chests, knowing death might crawl toward them through the grass at any moment. The fear was constant, but it became familiar. And familiarity, in time, turned into endurance. Guadalcanal became a study in improvisation. The Marines built their defenses in rings around Henderson Field, foxholes, barbed wire, and fields of fire woven between coconut palms. Machine guns were set in interlocking arcs, mortars buried in the mud. The Americans lacked heavy armor, but they had discipline and a sense of terrain. The Japanese excelled in night fighting. They moved silently, guided by hand signals and moonlight. Their tactics emphasized infiltration, small units slipping past the perimeter to strike command posts or supply depots. But they underestimated how well the Marines could hold their ground. At places like Alligator Creek, Japanese units launched frontal assaults, shouting "Banzai" as they charged across open ground. It was courage, pure and unflinching, but it was also suicide. American machine guns and mortars tore through the waves of attackers. The next morning, hundreds lay dead in the grass, their bayonets still fixed. By contrast, Marine tactics were pragmatic and evolving. They learned to use artillery not just for destruction, but for illumination, firing shells that burst in midair to light the battlefield. They developed listening posts beyond the wire, learned to ambush the ambushers, and turned captured Japanese weapons back against their owners. Every skirmish taught them something new. Every defense tightened their grip on the island, and slowly, the myth of the Americans' fear of the jungle began to rot in the same soil that buried its believers. In this war, machines mattered, but they had to fight nature as much as the enemy. The dense canopy made radar almost useless. Radios crackled with interference. Rifles rusted overnight in the humidity. Yet technology still became a deciding factor. The Marines' field telephones allowed instant coordination along the defensive line, while the Japanese relied heavily on couriers who could be lost or delayed. American artillery, 75mm pack howitzers, light enough to be dragged through mud, provided devastating fire support. Most critical of all was Henderson Field. From that strip of rough red earth, the Cactus Air Force changed the rhythm of battle. Their dauntless dive bombers hunted Japanese ships at sea, while Wildcats circled overhead, intercepting incoming raids. Every crate of fuel or ammunition that reached the airfield became sacred. Men died protecting it, hauling shells through the mud by hand when vehicles failed. The Japanese, too, deployed remarkable weapons: light, portable 70mm guns, deadly accurate mortars, and Arisaka rifles that rarely jammed. But they lacked one essential element: supply. Their ships were harassed constantly by U.S. planes. Entire convoys were sunk before reaching shore. Without food, without fuel, without communication, technology became weight. Men carried weapons they could not feed. As weeks turned into months, Guadalcanal transformed from a battle of armies into a battle of logistics, and the Americans, through adaptation and stubbornness, began to master that language of survival. At the center of Guadalcanal's chaos stood two men who could not have been more different. Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi, thin, disciplined, a believer in the Emperor's divine destiny. Opposite him, Major General Alexander Vandegrift of the United States Marine Corps, calm, deliberate, wary of waste. Kawaguchi's orders from Tokyo were absolute: recapture Henderson Field at any cost. He had only fragments of his original force, no armor, and almost no aerial cover, but disobedience was unthinkable. His soldiers marched through trackless jungle for days, carrying mortars by hand, arriving starved and fevered. He wrote in his diary that the jungle devours men faster than bullets. Still, he pressed on. Vandegrift's position was equally precarious. Cut off from reliable supply, his Marines were running low on ammunition and food. Naval support was uncertain after the catastrophic losses off Savo Island, yet he refused to retreat. He walked the perimeter daily, speaking softly to exhausted riflemen, insisting that the island could not fall. If Henderson goes, he told his officers, the Pacific goes with it. Leadership on Guadalcanal was not about orders. It was about belief that men could keep standing when every instinct told them to stop. Kawaguchi led by faith and sacrifice. Vandegrift led by faith and endurance. Only one philosophy could survive the island. For months before the invasion, Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans feared the jungle, that their civilization had made them weak. They expected panic, retreat, the sight of Western soldiers collapsing under heat and hunger. What they found instead were men who refused to yield. After each failed assault, Japanese survivors crawled back through the vines and mud, whispering disbelief. They had thrown themselves into the teeth of machine guns, and the Americans were still there the next morning, rebuilding trenches, dragging corpses aside, joking grimly about the smell. This sight tore at something deep within the Japanese psyche. The Bushido ideal, invincibility through spirit, began to unravel when confronted by an enemy who neither broke nor fled. The Emperor's warriors had been promised glory and death. Instead, they found anonymity in the jungle, their graves marked only by helmets half buried in the mud. For the Americans, the psychological toll ran just as deep. The ferocity of Japanese attacks, the refusal to surrender, shook them to their core. Prisoners were rare, ambushes were constant. The line between duty and vengeance blurred. Every rustle could be a ghost or a soldier. Every dead body might still hold a grenade. War in the jungle stripped men of ceremony. It became a contest of instincts, not good versus evil, but endurance versus extinction. And in that crucible, a strange respect was born. Marines began to call their opponents tough bastards, not out of hatred, but recognition. Many Japanese soldiers died believing the enemy was cowardly. Many Marines lived knowing he was anything but. Neither side truly owned Guadalcanal. The island owned them both. By October 1942, it had consumed nearly 20,000 Japanese and thousands of Americans. The jungle stank of rot and cordite, the rivers ran brown with runoff from shallow graves. In letters smuggled home, Marines wrote of faces without eyes and nights that never end. Japanese diaries, later found in the mud, spoke of an island that eats men alive. Each army viewed the other through the same veil of exhaustion. Japanese patrols stumbled upon abandoned Marine positions littered with empty tins and blood-soaked bandages, proof that their enemies suffered the same hunger. Americans advancing after a failed Japanese attack found discarded packs containing photos of families, Shinto amulets, school notebooks. Humanity lay everywhere, soaked through with rain. Guadalcanal blurred distinctions. The jungle erased uniforms, rank, even language. Both sides swatted the same mosquitoes, cursed the same storms, prayed to different gods for the same relief. In that sameness, something essential shifted, the recognition that endurance was not nationality, it was the last common ground between enemies. Night fell thick over the hills south of Henderson Field. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and silent. From the dense blackness below came faint movements, the scrape of metal, the rustle of branches, the low murmurs of men preparing for death. Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi's troops, numbering nearly 3,000, were moving into position. Their objective was clear: attack the Marine perimeter from the jungle high ground, slice through the thin defensive line, and seize Henderson Field by dawn. The terrain they would assault was known simply as Lunga Ridge, a narrow spine of earth rising out of the jungle like a scar. On it stood a few hundred Marines, many from the elite 1st Raider Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. They were tired, outnumbered, and running on meager supplies, but they understood what that ridge meant. Behind them lay the airfield, the lifeline of the entire campaign. As darkness deepened on September 12, the jungle erupted. Japanese mortars thudded in the distance. Tracers arced through the trees like orange lightning. From the treeline came the guttural cries of Tenno Hika Banzai. Long live the Emperor, as Kawaguchi's men surged uphill in waves. The Marines answered with machine gun fire so fierce it lit the ridge in flashes of orange and white. Bar gunners fired until barrels glowed red. Grenades rolled down the slopes, exploding among screaming shadows. Still the Japanese came, crawling, climbing, bayonets fixed, their faces painted with mud. Some reached the Marine lines, stabbing through gaps in the wire, fighting hand-to-hand in the rain-soaked darkness. Edson's men fell back in small groups, regrouping again and again, their discipline the only thing holding the line together. Edson himself moved among them, calm and deliberate, shouting orders barely audible over the chaos. "Hold the ridge," he told his men. "You'll do no running today." By midnight, the ridge was a charnel ground. Corpses littered the slopes. Wounded men screamed for medics who could not reach them. Ammunition ran low, bayonets replaced bullets. At dawn, a thin fog rolled in from the sea. In its dim light, the scale of the carnage became visible. Hundreds of Japanese bodies sprawled across the hillside, weapons still clutched in their hands. Yet Kawaguchi's surviving units were already regrouping for another assault. They came again on the night of September 13th. This time, the attack struck directly at the heart of Edson's line. Marines were pushed back to within meters of their command post. Some Japanese soldiers broke through, only to be cut down by concentrated fire. Others reached the crest, dying in close combat beneath flares and bayonet thrusts. The battle swayed hour by hour. Artillery from Henderson Field rained shells into the jungle, the explosions so close that tree trunks splintered into shrapnel. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the metallic sting of blood. By dawn on September 14th, the attacks faltered. Kawaguchi's forces were shattered, more than 800 dead, hundreds more wounded or lost in the undergrowth. The ridge remained in American hands. General Vandegrift's message to Washington was simple: "We have held." It was the first time in the Pacific War that Japanese ground forces had been decisively defeated in direct combat, but the cost was immense. The Marines had suffered heavy casualties. The ridge itself was blackened, trees splintered, the ground soaked red. Exhausted soldiers sat among the wreckage, staring blankly at the valley below. They had faced the myth head-on and survived. For the Japanese, the defeat at Edson's Ridge was more than tactical, it was spiritual. Kawaguchi withdrew into the jungle with a handful of survivors, his dream of a swift victory in ruins. He later wrote, "I have seen hell. It is the color of the jungle." Yet Tokyo refused to accept the loss. Reinforcements were already on the way. The next battles would be larger, bloodier, and fought not for a ridge, but for the island itself. The Americans knew what was coming. The Japanese would return in force, and Henderson Field would once again be the center of the storm. After the carnage on Edson's Ridge, Guadalcanal fell into a grim rhythm of anticipation. Each night, distant flashes lit the horizon, the Tokyo Express again, destroyers racing down the slot to deliver more men, more ammunition, more resolve. And each dawn, American pilots rose from Henderson Field to hunt them. The battle had shifted from a single ridge to an island-wide contest of attrition. By early October, the Japanese High Command launched Operation Ka, a massive effort to retake Guadalcanal once and for all. Reinforcements arrived under General Harakichi Hyakutake, veterans from the 2nd Division, disciplined and hardened. Their confidence was renewed, their orders absolute: recapture Henderson Field or die trying. They began by attacking along the Matanico River. The river's bends, lined with mangroves and thick vegetation, became the site of relentless clashes. Japanese units attempted to cross in daylight, believing surprise unnecessary. They met instant disaster. Marine artillery and mortars bracketed the crossings, turning the river into a cauldron of smoke and fire. Bodies floated downstream. Rifles were lost in the current. Survivors crawled to the banks, only to be cut down by snipers hidden in the brush. When night fell, the Japanese regrouped. They crossed farther upstream, slipping through the jungle, trying to encircle the Marine positions. Yet each time they struck, they found the Americans waiting. Listening posts had caught their approach, and artillery zeroed in on the sound of movement. By mid-October, the rains came again. The airfield turned into a swamp, planes sinking into the soft earth, mechanics working knee-deep in mud to keep engines alive. The Cactus Air Force, short on fuel and spare parts, still flew daily, bombing enemy ships, strafing jungle trails, sometimes landing on one wheel because there was no other choice. On the nights of October 13th to 15th, the Japanese Navy launched what became known as the bombardment of Henderson Field. 2 battleships, Congo and Haruna, approached under cover of darkness and unleashed nearly 1,000 shells on the airfield. The explosions flattened fuel dumps, shredded aircraft, and turned the surrounding jungle into flame. For hours, the island trembled. Marines lay flat in trenches, the sky erupting in orange flashes. When the bombardment ended, silence fell like a final blow. By morning, smoke hung over the airstrip. Craters pocked the runway. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed. For a moment, it seemed Henderson was finished. But by afternoon, mechanics were already filling craters with gravel, dragging wrecks aside, patching what could be saved. By evening, a single Wildcat roared down the runway, proof that the field still lived. The next week, Hyakutake ordered the final assault. His troops, nearly 7,000 strong, attacked from multiple directions. At night, they charged into walls of machine gun fire, their silhouettes illuminated by flares. The 164th Infantry, recently arrived U.S. reinforcements from the Army's Americall Division, fought shoulder to shoulder with the Marines, the first sign of a broader Allied unity on the island. It was a slaughter. Artillery shells burst among the attackers, cutting down entire companies. Mortars fell with deadly precision. Some Japanese soldiers reached the wire, only to die clawing at it. Others wandered lost in the jungle, starving and fevered, pursued by patrols who found them days later, delirious and skeletal. By the end of October, the great offensive had failed. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead in the mud. Henderson Field still stood. Yet even defeat at sea remained to be endured. On the nights of November 12th to 15th, The waters north of Guadalcanal, soon called Iron Bottom Sound, became a graveyard of ships. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers clashed at point-blank range in a series of chaotic naval battles. Searchlights cut through the dark, shells exploded at distances so close that sailors were burned by their own gun blasts. The Japanese Navy fought with unmatched bravery, but its mission to deliver reinforcements to Guadalcanal failed. Transport ships were sunk before they could unload. Thousands of soldiers drowned or burned in the water. When the sea battle ended, the Americans held both Henderson Field and the surrounding airspace. For the first time in the Pacific, the Japanese offensive had been broken not by luck, but by endurance. By late November, the island was a ruin. The jungle stank of smoke and decay. The survivors, Japanese and American alike, stared across the same fields of death and wondered how any of them were still alive. The tide of war had shifted. The myth of invincibility was gone, but the cost of that revelation was written in the mud, the blood, and the endless sound of rain. By December 1942, Guadalcanal was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. The palm trees were shattered, the rivers clogged with debris, and the once green hills had turned gray with ash. The jungle had reclaimed its stillness, but beneath every vine and puddle lay reminders of the horror that had unfolded. For 6 months, both sides had poured men and material into this remote corner of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese called it Jigaku no Shima, the Island of Hell. The name was no exaggeration. Tokyo's command finally faced what no one dared say aloud: Guadalcanal was lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy, battered and bleeding, could no longer supply the troops stranded on the island. The once proud Tokyo Express now ferried food instead of soldiers, and even that was not enough. By January 1943, the average Japanese soldier on the island was living on less than 200 calories a day. Men collapsed mid-march, too weak to lift rifles. Malaria and dysentery spread unchecked. Those who could still walk were ordered to carry ammunition instead of food. One Marine later recalled finding enemy soldiers so thin they looked like shadows, men who had fought until their bodies gave out. The Japanese troops still fought bravely, ambushing patrols and harassing supply lines, but their resistance had become survival more than strategy. Commanders tried to maintain discipline, but starvation erased rank. Officers and enlisted men foraged side by side, eating insects, tree bark, and whatever they could find. When Imperial headquarters finally approved evacuation, it was an admission that shook Japan's military identity to its core. Operation Ko, the withdrawal plan, began in late January 1943. Under cover of darkness and bad weather, Japanese destroyers slipped through the narrow channel once more, this time not to deliver soldiers, but to rescue them. Over the course of 3 weeks, between February 1st and 7th, they extracted roughly 10,000 survivors from the island's western beaches. Most were so emaciated they could barely climb aboard. They carried rifles without ammunition, tattered flags, and haunted eyes. For the Japanese military, Guadalcanal was more than a lost island, it was the first undeniable proof that their empire could bleed. The aura of unstoppable momentum that had defined 1941 and 1942 was broken. On the American side, the victory came at a cost nearly as staggering. Out of roughly 60,000 U.S. troops who served on Guadalcanal, more than 7,000 were dead or missing, and another 8,000 wounded. Disease accounted for far more casualties than bullets. Malaria alone struck 2/3 of the men. Those who lived carried the scars in silence. They had seen the face of war stripped of grandeur, a war of mud, rot, and waiting. One Marine sergeant described it simply: "There were no heroes here, only men who didn't die." Yet amid the ruin, the meaning of Guadalcanal began to take shape. The myth of American weakness in the tropics, a belief preached by Japanese officers for a decade, had died in the jungle. So had the illusion of Japanese invincibility. The island had become the first great pivot of the Pacific War, a symbol of endurance, proof that Japan could be stopped, and that the United States could fight a long, grinding campaign far from home. But the lesson came at a terrible price. The jungle had claimed tens of thousands of young lives, and in doing so, revealed the true face of the Pacific conflict: not quick victories, but a slow, devouring war of exhaustion. In the weeks after the Japanese evacuation, American patrols swept through the empty jungle, finding only silence. They expected ambushes, but there were none. What they found instead were shallow graves, abandoned camps, and the wreckage of an army that had ceased to exist. The bodies were thin, uniforms torn, rifles stacked neatly beside them, the discipline of a defeated force that had died still believing in duty. The Marines stood among the ruins of Henderson Field, now fully secured, and realized what they had accomplished. The airstrip that had been under siege for 6 relentless months was now a functioning base, aircraft landing in regular rhythm. Engineers expanded it, Seabees arrived to lay down steel mats, and the Cactus Air Force became the spearhead for future offensives across the Pacific. But the victory was not celebrated with cheers. It was quiet, somber, reflective. Too many men were missing. Too many were buried under wooden crosses already leaning in the rain. Guadalcanal had marked the turning of the tide. For the Allies, it proved that Japan could be stopped not through overwhelming superiority, but through adaptation, endurance, and the will to suffer longer. It was not the end of the Pacific War, but it was the end of the illusion that Japan could dictate its terms. For Japan, the consequences were catastrophic. The loss shattered confidence in the Imperial General Staff and eroded faith in the Navy's dominance. The aura of invincibility built from victories at Singapore, Java, and the Philippines was gone. Officers began to speak in cautious tones. The myth of the Emperor's divine protection no longer held sway over every soldier. More tangible still was the strategic shift. Guadalcanal secured the sea lanes between the United States and Australia, ensuring a base of operations for the coming offensives in the Solomons and New Guinea. From Henderson Field, American bombers would soon strike at Rabaul, the fortress once thought untouchable. It also changed the psychology of warfare in the Pacific. No longer would the Japanese be seen as superhuman foes immune to hardship. They were revealed as men brave, disciplined, but mortal. Likewise, American troops learned that victory in this theater demanded something more than courage, patience, resilience, and a tolerance for misery beyond imagination. The campaign also reshaped command thinking. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur studied Guadalcanal's lessons closely. Amphibious logistics, air-ground coordination, medical evacuation, and jungle tactics all would be refined from this crucible. What was improvised on Guadalcanal became doctrine for the island-hopping war that followed. The Japanese evacuation, though tactically brilliant, left behind a moral wound that never healed. The soldiers who returned were treated as ghosts, survivors of an operation that had failed the Emperor. Some were shamed into silence, others were sent to new fronts where they would die in anonymity. Guadalcanal had shown Japan the limits of faith against industry, and the limits of courage against endurance. In the United States, news of victory spread slowly, competing with reports of losses in North Africa and the Atlantic. Yet for those who understood the Pacific, Guadalcanal was everything. It marked the moment when the Allies moved from defense to offense, the beginning of a march that would not stop until Tokyo itself lay in ruins. One American correspondent wrote, "The island is quiet now, but its silence is the sound of a world turning." The graves were dug, the airfield buzzed with life, and the ships departed. But in every man who left Guadalcanal, Japanese or American, something fundamental had changed. They had looked into the darkest corner of human endurance and found no glory there, only survival. The jungle of Guadalcanal is silent now. The vines have reclaimed the trenches. The airstrip, once cratered by shells, is a ribbon of green under the Pacific sun. Only the rusted remnants of war remain, twisted metal, sunken barges, and the faint outlines of foxholes where men once waited for dawn that might never come. Here, history whispers. Guadalcanal was never about glory. It was about endurance, the brutal confrontation between two nations that believed their will could outlast the others. In the end, it wasn't strategy or technology that decided the island's fate. It was exhaustion, hunger, disease, the sheer refusal of one side to yield. For Japan, the campaign marked the unraveling of an empire built on speed and certainty. For America, it was the painful awakening into a new kind of war, one fought not for territory, but for survival inch by inch, tree by tree, island by island. Every soldier who stepped into the jungle learned the same truth. The enemy was not just across the ridge or behind the gun, it was the land itself, the rain, the insects, the endless night. Guadalcanal redefined modern warfare. It proved that control of the air could decide the fate of the sea, that logistics could be as decisive as bravery, and that the human spirit, when tested to its limit, could shape the course of nations. But beneath those grand lessons lies something more fragile: humanity. In diaries recovered from both sides, the words are strikingly similar: fear, hunger, loneliness, the smell of rain. The uniforms differed, but the suffering was shared. Today, the island stands as a quiet monument not just to victory or defeat, but to endurance itself. The ghosts of those who fought here rest beneath the palms, their story carved into the soil of the Pacific. Guadalcanal was where the tide turned not with triumph, but with survival. And from that survival came the long, brutal path toward the end of a world at war.